And our government and governments all around the world have discovered a lot more about what is going on digital platforms. So when we draft legislation, when we consider legislating, we have to do it with all the evidence, all the facts, and I'm aware of the fact that digital platforms do a lot of positive things for people. People like them. It's a good thing that people can communicate directly and communicate all around the world. That's a good thing. But at the same time, over the past 2.5 years, we've discovered a lot of things that don't do any good for society. So I think we're at a point in time, not just here in Canada, but all around the world, where we need to think about how we could legislate or regulate digital platforms in a way that preserves the benefits to society, but we need to come up with legislation that won't just apply to what's happened in the past, but it also has to be forward-looking, and that's a big challenge for government, and I think that's the point we're at right now.
For the election? Perhaps not specifically before the election, but I think that there can be a lot of work that's done. I would also note that the Grand Committee of Parliamentarians will be coming to Ottawa at the end of May, and I think that is a really important, unique moment where you have 9 parliamentarians from 9 different countries that are looking at this issue specifically, which is, I'm not sure if that's ever happened before in the history of the world. And so we have a really important moment, and our job is to look at what has happened elsewhere in the world and to see how we can prepare and do something that works in the Canadian context.
Jim Bronskill, Canadian Press.
Given the lack of cooperation from the social media companies, what sort of specific regulatory measures are you considering?
Well, we are looking at what has already happened around the world. So, you know, in the EU, with their code of practice, with GDPR, the UK's white paper today, and the concept of the duty of care is very interesting. Australia has come out recently with legislation that would hold social media executives to account for activities that take place on their platform. There are a number of things that are ongoing, but what is most important for me is to think about a regulatory framework that would apply into the future, because what we don't want is to regulate and legislate for something of the past and not be looking forwards. And I think that what is clear to me and clear to the government is that technology is changing very rapidly, and the platforms are and have been able to avoid being held to account for the activities that take place on their platforms for too long. And so how do we ensure and develop something that will stand the test of time moving forward?
And a question for Ms. Bruce. As the election approaches, what keeps you up at night? What is your worst fear or concern?
Well, the report outlines many of those. So we've looked at the large ecosystem that is our electoral process from the point of view of the voters, from the point of view of political parties, and also from the point of view of the election system itself. So those are quite well articulated in this space. I think if there's anything that keeps me up, it's just hoping that Canadians are attentive in this space, and also that they're practicing basic cybersecurity hygiene and knowing that that can inoculate them to a large degree from many of the threats that we've articulated in the report.
Okay, we have roughly 5 minutes left, so we'll keep going here. Ahmed Hathout, The Wire Report.
We've heard from Facebook saying that the ad registry under C-76 would be difficult, but they would comply. We've heard from Google saying no, but then they're not going to have certain political ads on their platform. Have you heard any updates from the other holdouts like Twitter? Have they said that they would potentially comply? with C76?
So Twitter has not committed one way or the other yet. So, but I should note that Twitter does have an Transparency Center that they had during the U.S. midterms. So I believe that they would have the capacity to do that, but they have not made a decision whether they would or whether they wouldn't have one here in Canada.
And are there other social media companies that are out there that you were talking to, or is that?
We've had conversations with Pinterest, Reddit, and Microsoft. I believe that's it so far, but those conversations have been fairly productive. But they're, with regards to those three platforms, the level of political advertising activity would be almost nothing here in Canada on those platforms, but they have been very interesting conversations, in fact, and Reddit is a slightly different space because it's more community managed, and they act very differently. But we've had some very interesting conversations with kind of the kind of secondary platforms.
Lena Dib, La Presse Canadienne.
Alors, on comprend, Madame Gould.
So we understand, Ms. Gould, that there will be no legislation before the next election. So if during the election campaign, just in practical terms, what are you going to do? What are you going to be doing? How are we going to protect ourselves against any threats? I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
For social media platforms between now and October. So my question is, in a practical sense, there's going to be, we're assuming, cyber attacks during this election campaign. So what will be happening to counter those attacks?
So nous avons déjà fait le projet de loi Censor.
We've already drafted Bill C-76 that deals with political advertising on digital platforms. So whenever there's over 100,000 visitors to a site, there has to be a registry of political advertising. That's a very important step. If the platforms do not participate in that registry, they cannot run political ads. So that's a concrete and important step we've taken. The second thing is that in Bill C-76, it says that platforms and websites cannot accept political ads that are paid for by foreign funds. So that's another concrete step we've taken. In addition, every ad that's run on the internet has to indicate who paid for the ad and give contact information. That's another concrete step we've taken in that area. Also in Bill C-76, we created new rules for third parties. There are limits now, caps on what third parties can spend on advertising during an election campaign. That's yet another concrete step that we've taken. The most important thing Canadians can do to protect us as a democracy is to be alert and critical of the information they see on the internet. People have to look further and investigate if there's something bizarre, something that doesn't make sense. We need to find out where the information comes from. There have been lots of examples. The most direct targets for foreign meddling, the target of choice is the voter, the ordinary Canadian, because it's the voter who has the power to decide who's going to govern Canadians and themselves as individuals and the whole country. So the CSE has produced this report. I hope Canadians will take the time to read it. But there are a number of products that also explain to Canadians how they can have good cyber hygiene. That maybe doesn't sound quite so good in French, but what are the best practices in the area of cyber hygiene to make sure that Canadians don't become victims of cyber threats. You said that Facebook wanted a one-size-fits-all regulation that would apply around the world. Is that something that you are contemplating in terms of your cooperation with other countries? Do you think you could all agree on one set of rules for a worldwide set of rules? Well, I think Facebook thinks that would be easier if there was one set of rules for the entire planet, but that's very hard to get. I think at this point there's a certain amount of cooperation among democratic countries, so there could certainly be similarities in what we expect from digital platforms, but I think at the same time digital platforms have to accept the fact and take responsibility for the fact that different countries have different laws, different customs, different values. And it's not for the digital media, digital platforms, to dictate to sovereign countries what their legislation should say. Of course, it would be easier for digital platforms to have only one piece of legislation to follow, but it's very hard to apply one piece of legislation worldwide. Countries are different, they have different cultures, different laws, and I think we could perhaps have some cooperation so that there would be international standards, but at the same time, digital platforms are going to have to accept that they have to abide by domestic legislation from country to country all around the world.
What exactly is stopping you from forcing social media companies to be at the stage that you want them to be at now, especially since other countries have done this?
So with regards to social media platforms, we have been in conversation with them on these issues, and now we're going to be looking at next steps and what else needs to be done. We are looking at existing laws and trying to understand how those apply already, and then looking at the gaps of where we need to do something further. Up until now, as with many industries, there has been a call and a saying from the social media platforms that they will be addressing these issues. We have not seen them address them to the place that we would be comfortable allowing them to continue in this self-regulatory space.
And because our election process is mostly based on paper, right? How could that help us avoid threats? And is it fair to say that you want to keep this paper system going forward?
Yes, so that was one of the few things that the All-Party Committee on Electoral Reform agreed on, was to stay with a paper-based system and not move towards electronic voting. And I think that what is important for Canadians to note is that because it is a paper-based system, because we go to the polling booth and we get out our pencil and our paper and put it in the into the ballot box, that the actual vote itself we can have a lot of confidence in terms of the results. And, the CSE is working with Elections Canada to make sure that their website and their systems are protected, and so we can have a lot of confidence in that. Where we have vulnerabilities is when it comes to individuals, both Canadian voters, when it comes to politicians, and in fact when it comes to the media as well, and the information that we have and the information that we consume. And we know that there are disinformation campaigns that have gone on around the world to try and influence voters and how they make their decisions. At the end of the day, when a Canadian decides who they vote for, the results are correct. Those are the results because Canadians have made their decision based on the information that they have at their disposal. What this report is trying to do is to say, here are the different methods that may be used during an election to try and influence your vote. Take the power back. Be critical, look at the information, look at the sources that you're getting, and use that to make your decision. And I have full confidence in Canadians that they will do just that they are already doing that, and that this information just serves to bolster the knowledge that they have to make informed choices.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone.
Thank you.